Welcome back to the second in our CT Brief Honest Conversations mini-series on complaints handling. In part 2, our speakers discuss what trends there are around complaints handling and organisational culture, how complaints handling approach and outcomes may support in-depth assessments, and top tips for housing providers and local authorities on complaints handling.
Francesca, it strikes me that there's some really interesting messages coming through around complaints and organisational culture, and I know that's an area you've been doing a lot of work around. What are some of the main trends you're seeing?
Yeah, so we've recently been developing a complaints culture scan, which we want to be piloting with some organisations to be able to see how colleagues, I guess, perceive the complaints culture within an organisation, as we know how important getting that right is translating to the success of complaints. We're being able to see from the early data that there's sometimes a difference between how the board and the exec teams view complaints culture in comparison to those on the ground. I think there's obviously sometimes a narrative around the idea that they're told, do the right thing, there's a clear message, we are prioritising making sure complaints are resolved. However, when it comes to actually getting to the position of trying to resolve it, there are barriers in the way that prevents people from being able to do that. I think there's definitely a big thing within this positive complaints culture around data and being able to log data and use data and giving people the time to really interrogate what are the overall trends that are coming from it, but actually being able to use it on an individual case-by-case basis. So they're able to see that customer's journey right from when they've let you know something's gone wrong to closing the complaint and it's resolved, and being able to put that tier ownership in place.
That's really interesting, thanks. I think data just comes up so much in so many parts of our work, so interesting to hear you reflect on that in terms of the individual as well as the broader messages that data might be giving you. Sue, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on what Francesca just said, which is I'm often in boards where anything you can measure and write down and put in a paper gets attention and gets discussed. And culture is something that everybody says, of course, yes, absolutely, or even repeat regularly, it's a no-blame culture. But because we rarely have any way of sort of measuring it, it never gets put in a paper, it never gets challenged. And so I think the work that Francesca's been doing on this culture scan survey aligns with other work we're doing on different kinds of culture scanning, and it can give boards something to look at and consider and challenge around the frontline culture, which is quite difficult for them to get a handle on, barring the sort of usual kind of wandering around approach. So I think it's fascinating, the stuff that you're coming up with as you develop that tool.
And a slightly different angle now, Sue, back to you again. If I'm a housing association or a council and I come to you and put a question to you, how might our complaints handling approach and outcomes support our next IDA? What would you say?
Well, I think we're working with clients today who have had the complaints elements really highlighted and focused on in their IDAs that are occurring today. So the regulator is continuing to pilot its approach to integrating the new consumer standards from April of next year into the in-depth assessment methodology. We are already seeing a lot more focus on the complaints data. And I think in part it's there's sort of two aspects to it really. One is the data that they will already have before they come to the document request. So they will have the Housing Ombudsman data and the ability to identify outliers in the Housing Ombudsman statistics. And then they will have the tenant satisfaction measures. And again, they'll be able to identify outliers in those statistics. And just as they've always done with the value for money metrics, for example, is they use those as can openers, as reasons to ask people questions. So the question is not why are you 39.7 and the organisation down the road is 35.4. That's not the question. The question is you appear to be in the worst performing quartile of the distribution. And is there any, what reasons are you aware of as to why that might be the case? So I think you should expect questions from the tenant satisfaction metrics and the Housing Ombudsman data, and you should have an awareness before you even get close to an IDA of your benchmarking in those areas, so that you're not surprised if you're found to be in an outlier in those distributions, or similarly, you know that you're about the middle of the table or you're equivalent to your peers, what you consider your peers. So that's external data, and you shouldn't be surprised that they turn up with that data and ask questions about it. And then internally, I think you should expect it to be in the document request. So all of the things we spoke about earlier when you said what should boards be looking at, or the customer committee or the ops committee, what should they be looking at? A lot of that stuff will now be in a document request, and we're seeing that in the IDAs where the regulator is extending its piloting activity. That how you report on complaints and to whom is part of the document request, so you should expect that. And then a bit sort of broader than complaints, we do know that they will be observing customer committees or similar, not just on complaints, but on the issues of tenant engagement, involvement, transparency, all of those issues that appear in the new standards. So you should expect that as well. So I think if you're taking complaints seriously and learning from them and can articulate how you learn from the complaints, both your internally resolved ones and the Housing Ombudsman resolved ones, you should be in a really good place for this bit of an IDA. It's a chance to shine, actually, for some people, where the bit that you really love and put a lot of passion into perhaps hasn't featured in what might be considered a sort of dry finance and governance IDA, is now really going to be a focus, and I think that can only be a good thing.
That makes sense. Thanks, Sue.
I was going to say with that, Sue, I think it's a really good point what you're saying then. I think a lot of the messaging that we're hearing from these IDAs, it's that it's assurance around what you're doing with it. So you might be, perhaps you are scoring lower, performing lower, but if you've got a good action plan and how you're going to get yourself out of there, that's obviously going to go a long way with reassuring the regulator of your position.
And that's a good point, because the other point is that the regulator's approach to this is the same as their approach to everything else, which is how is the board assured that? So it's, for a board member, it's how do you know that your complaints handling is effective and is leading to service improvement? So if you can answer that question, then you'll be able to show it to the regulator. So, Catherine, I wanted to turn the tables and ask you a question. We know you've been working with a number of housing providers around complaints in recent months. And from that work that you've done, I wondered if you could just kind of articulate a couple of top tips that you would give providers to improve their approach.
Absolutely. I suppose it can feel like there's a lot being thrown around with regards to complaints at the moment, and particularly when organisations feel that stuff coming through the Housing Ombudsman, that was things you were doing 2 years ago, and perhaps you feel processes have moved on. So I suppose my first tip, my overriding tip, is keep your head in this. Don't get lost in becoming responsive and just reacting. Yeah. Don't panic, in big friendly letters. Siggy talked a lot about the importance of good governance, about the oversight and learning from complaints, and linked to that, I'd very much say it's important to have an element of the business that's about stepping back, looking at the patterns, looking at improvements in terms of complaints handling, but also the substantive issues. And as with any improvement plan, having milestones, having evidence improvements, and ideally sharing that with your board, but also with your staff and your residents. I think the second tip is, it sounds so self-evident, but focus on the issues themselves. It can get really easy to get so tied up with complaints numbers increasing or decreasing, or more stage 1s or more stage 2s, that it can almost lose the issues themselves. And I think it's just a reminder that behind every number, there's a complaint, and there's someone's home, someone's services that need to be looked at and improve someone's life. Absolutely. So focus on the issues themselves. And in terms of learning, I would say the more upstream you can get, of course, you're going to focus on the housing ombudsman, maladministrations, on the big things that have gone wrong. And that's absolutely right and proper. But the more you can get upstream of complaints and look proactively at what's coming, with a cold winter or a weather event, or the kind of traffic you're getting through in email requests or phone calls from customers, the more you can respond and kind of preempt complaints, which, frankly is better all round. The third tip I'd give is actually about remembering that whilst the Ombudsman is very important and rightly is in people's minds, actually you're not doing this for the Housing Ombudsman. I think there's something around co-production and really working with residents to get a complaints process that's absolutely compliant with the Complaints Handling Code, which actually is a bit of a gift in terms of looking at good ways of doing things, but work with your residents to understand what they need, what they want, to make sure the process is accessible. And whilst, as I say, the Ombudsman is important, remember who we're actually doing this for and make sure they are a key part of the conversation.
It's really important. It's very easy to get a little bit taken over by worrying about the Ombudsman and the regulator.
I think so.
And there's some fundamentals, isn't there, that somebody who's living in a house that's really, really unsuitable. And we should be really upset about that, and that it may have arisen, and worry how we can make sure it doesn't happen again. How you improve your complaints handling and your complaints resolution is probably best worked out with your residents.
Yeah, I would concur. And I think, again, with your colleagues as well, and those that are having to actually handle those complaints, making sure they're involved in that. Your people that work in your customer service centres, your contact centres, they're going to know more than anyone what's on your residents' minds. They're speaking to them every single day. So it's making sure you've got the right people in the room to help improve whether it's services or the complaint process itself.
Thanks for listening, and join us for part 3, which looks at what's new in the Housing Ombudsman's Code, which was updated on the 8th of February 2024.